My name is Liliana Vance. I am 34 years old. When the trauma team at Brooke Army Medical Center was rushing me into surgery to stop the internal bleeding from a shattered spleen after a head-on collision, my mother sent a text to our family group chat calling me a nuisance and a burden, explaining that she and my father were currently at the Taylor Swift concert with my sister and wouldn't be coming to help with my children. I am a captain in the United States Army Medical Service Corps, an officer trained to lead the complex logistics and healthcare administration that keeps a Level 1 trauma center functioning under the weight of a mass casualty event. And as I lay there in that San Antonio heat, I realized that while the Army trusted me with millions of dollars in equipment and the lives of soldiers, my own parents viewed my survival as an interruption to their social calendar. From my hospital bed at Fort Sam Houston, I ended up hiring a private security and nanny service at triple the Texas market rate to protect my twins. And then I made the only decision that mattered. I cut off every cent of the thousands of dollars I had been quietly sending my parents every single month for nearly a decade. The mortgage payments on their 4-bedroom colonial in Alamo Heights, the premium health insurance, the European luxury car repairs, and the constant bailouts for my sister's failed lifestyle consulting business were gone in a single afternoon. I've carried this story in silence for so long, but I know I'm not the only one who has felt invisible to the people they love. It takes a lot of strength to admit when the people who should have been your foundation are the ones who let you fall. I'd really love to know where you're listening from today, so please leave your city and state in the comments. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. I need to tell you about the moment I realized my sister was the only one who truly had a place in that house. Growing up in the Vance household in the old money neighborhood of Alamo Heights, San Antonio, I learned very early that my parents had a specific kind of vision for our family, and I was never the center of it. My older sister, Cassidy Vance, 37, a self-styled lifestyle consultant and influencer, which in reality meant she spent my father's money to look successful on social media, had always been the golden child. She was the one who walked through life with a magnetic grace that seemed to make my father, Garrett Vance, 64 years old, a retired sales manager who measured a man's worth by the brand of the truck he drove and the zip code he lived in, and my mother, Lorraine Vance, 62, a permanent fixture in San Antonio's social volunteer committees, light up whenever she entered a room. When I told them I wanted to join the Army and become an officer in the Medical Service Corps, my father just gave a sharp, practical nod and said that at least the government would be the one paying for my mistakes instead of him. Practical was the word they used for me, a word that felt like a cold stone in my pocket, while they showered my sister with words like visionary and star. I told myself it didn't matter, and I buried that quiet ache under the weight of military regulations and healthcare administration manuals, clawing my way through officer candidate school at Fort Moore, and then into the specialized training required to run medical logistics for the Department of Defense. I spent years becoming a captain and a logistics expert, stationed at Joint Base San Antonio, Fort Sam Houston, the very heart of Army medicine. The day I graduated and received my commission should have been the proudest moment of my life. But my parents arrived nearly 2 hours late because my sister had an emergency photo shoot for her influencer brand at the Pearl District, and they simply had to drop her off first. There were no flowers, no celebratory dinner at a Texas steakhouse like Bohannon's, and not even a moment to acknowledge the Army service uniform I wore with such pride. There was only a quick photo in the gravel parking lot before they rushed off, because my sister needed emotional support after a brand deal didn't go as planned. I watched them drive away, and I made excuses for them, telling myself that the creative industry was volatile, and my sister simply needed more of their strength, while the military was stable, and I was built to handle things on my own. But what I didn't fully grasp at the time was that my parents' favoritism had become a financial structure, and I was the one who was quietly footing the bill for their entire lives. It started 8 years ago, shortly after I became a commissioned officer, when my father called me late one night with his voice tight and heavy with a rehearsed kind of embarrassment. He told me they were in a bit of a bind with the mortgage on the Alamo Heights house and asked if I could help them out, just this once. A request that felt like a duty I was honored to perform for the people who raised me. I transferred $2,400 that night through my USAA account without a second thought, but that just this once turned into every single month for 8 years, followed by $800 a month for their health insurance when my father's former company dropped their retiree coverage. Then came the endless stream of emergencies. The leaking roof on the San Antonio house after a Texas thunderstorm, the transmission failing on my mother's German SUV, and the constant injections of cash into Cassidy's business whenever her social media engagement slumped. I never said no, even when I became a single mother to my 3-year-old twins Leo and Maya, and their father walked out of our lives. I remember calling my mother from Brooke Army Medical Center when I was pregnant and terrified during a medical scare, and she told me they wished they could come, but my sister was so stressed after a trunk show in Austin that she really needed them at home. They didn't come for the birth of my children, and they didn't come during those first months when I was managing hospital logistics between 24-hour shifts, but the automatic transfers from my bank account never stopped going out. I kept a spreadsheet on my government laptop, a habit of military precision I couldn't break. And when I finally looked at the total after nearly a decade, the number was staggering. Over $360,000 in U.S. currency had flowed from my life into theirs. I never asked for a parade or a thank you note, but I also never expected that the people I had been carrying on my back for years would eventually describe me as a burden to my face. The accident happened while I was driving home towards Cibolo after a grueling 16-hour shift at Brooke Army Medical Center. I was alert, but my body was heavy with the kind of fatigue only a logistics officer in a Level 1 trauma center truly understands. The mental exhaustion of tracking blood supply chains, managing bed capacity for incoming medevacs, and ensuring that every piece of high-stakes equipment was exactly where it needed to be for the surgeons to save lives. As I pulled through a green light at a major intersection in San Antonio, the late summer glare reflecting off the asphalt, I never saw the heavy-duty pickup truck that ran the red light at 50 miles per hour. The impact hit my driver's side door with a sound like a small explosion, glass shattering into 1,000 diamonds, and the scream of twisting metal filling my ears before the world simply went black. I woke up in the back of an ambulance with a searing, white-hot pain blooming in my abdomen and a familiar face hovering over me. Major Marcus Thorne, the Deputy Commander for Clinical Services at BAMC, who happened to be the senior officer on trauma call that night. His voice was careful and professional, but I could see the flicker of concern in his eyes as he told me I had been in a serious accident and they were rushing me into the operating room for internal bleeding. The word surgery hit me harder than the truck because all I could think about were my children, Leo and Maya, who were currently with a babysitter who had to leave by 8 o'clock to catch her bus back to Universal City. I fumbled for my phone with hands that were shaking and smeared with my own blood, my heart racing as I dialed my father's number, praying that, for once, the $360,000 I had given them over the years had bought me at least 1 hour of their time. My father answered on the fourth ring, his voice sounding impatient and distracted, the background noise of the Alamo Heights house echoing with the frantic energy of people getting ready for a big night out. I gasped out the words, telling him I was in an accident and being taken to Joint Base San Antonio, Fort Sam Houston for surgery, begging him and my mother to just drive the 10 minutes to my house to watch the twins. There was a long, hollow silence on the other end of the line. And then I heard muffled voices. My mother's tone sounded sharp and annoyed, and I heard my sister's laughter echoing from the living room. The line went dead, and a moment later, my phone buzzed with a notification from our family group chat that would change the trajectory of my life forever. The message was from my mother, Lorraine Vance, and it read, "Liliana, you've always been a nuisance and a burden. We have Taylor Swift tickets with Cassidy tonight, and we've been planning this for months. Figure it out yourself." I read those words 3 times, the light of the screen blinding me as a second message appeared from my father, telling me that since I was a logistics officer at a hospital, I was used to these environments, and I shouldn't make this a bigger deal than it needed to be. Then my sister sent a single laughing emoji, a tiny yellow face that felt like a physical blow to my chest while I lay there bleeding on a stretcher. Major Marcus Thorne was watching me, and though he didn't say a word, I saw the way his jaw tightened when he glimpsed the screen of my phone before it finally died. In that moment, something inside me that had been held together by Army duty and hope finally snapped. I looked at Major Marcus Thorne, and I didn't see just a superior officer anymore. I saw the only person in the world who was currently standing between me and the end of my life. I remember thinking as they wheeled me into the trauma ward that I had spent my entire adult life learning how to triage the broken systems of a military medical facility. Yet I couldn't even diagnose the rot that had been sitting in my own living room for 34 years. The Army teaches you that you never leave a fallen comrade behind, a principle that is drilled into your soul from the first day of officer candidate school. But as the anesthesia began to cloud my mind, the only thing I could hear was the digital echo of my mother's voice telling me to figure it out myself. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a betrayal like that. The kind where you realize the person you were calling for help is the one who's been holding you under the water all along. And I think anyone who has ever had to carry a family secret knows that silence is heavier than any physical weight. It's the sound of a foundation cracking under a house you thought was safe. And as I drifted into the blackness of the surgery, I felt a strange, cold peace. The kind of peace that comes when you finally stop trying to hold up a wall that was always meant to fall. I know we all want to believe our families would drop everything for us in a crisis. But sometimes, the people who share your blood are the ones who value their own comfort more than your life. It's a hard thing to admit, but finding that truth is the first step toward reclaiming your own power. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this was your family? And please, take a second to press the like button and subscribe, because what my parents decided to do next while I was recovering, I don't think anyone expected it, including them. When I finally woke up 3 days later, the air in the recovery room felt thick and tasted of hospital-grade oxygen and the faint metallic scent of antiseptic that always reminds me of my early training at the Medical Professional Training Center. The South Texas sun was pouring through the window, bright and unforgiving, and for a moment, I forgot about the truck and the text message and the $360,000 I had bled into the Alamo Heights house. I looked down at my hands and saw the IV lines and the bruised skin, and I felt the deep pulling ache in my abdomen where they had removed my ruptured spleen and stitched my life back together. The nurse told me that Major Thorne had checked on me every few hours and that my children were safe and being cared for by the Texas certified service I had hired from my hospital bed. But there was no mention of my father or my mother or the sister I had practically raised with my own captain's paychecks. I lay there in the quiet of that army ward, and my mind drifted back to the very first time I had stepped up to save them, long before the Army gave me a rank or a mission. It was a blistering afternoon in August, the kind of San Antonio heat that makes the asphalt shimmer, and my father had sat me down at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and a look of such profound defeat that it made my heart ache. He told me that his sales commissions had dried up and that the bank was threatening to take the house, the only home I had ever known, and he looked at me with those tired eyes and said I was his only hope. I was 26 then, just starting my career in the Medical Service Corps, and I felt a surge of pride that I could be the one to protect them, the one who was strong enough to carry the burden that was crushing him. I didn't realize then that by saying yes that first time, I was volunteering for a deployment that had no end date and no objective other than my own slow exhaustion. I remember thinking, if I sign this wire transfer, I'm not just paying a bill, I'm proving that I love them more than I love my own future. I thought I was building a bridge back to their hearts, but I was really just building a platform for them to stand on while they looked down at me. It wasn't until I was scrolling through my bank records from my hospital bed at BAMPS that I saw the truth. The emergency mortgage payment I sent that very first time matched the exact down payment for the luxury European coupe my sister Cassidy started driving a week later. As the days of my recovery crawled by in that quiet wing of Brooke Army Medical Center, the silence from the house in Alamo Heights became deafening, and I realized that my parents weren't just avoiding the hospital because they were embarrassed. They were avoiding it because I was no longer useful to them in my current state. To them, a wounded captain was a liability, and since I couldn't sign a check or authorize a transfer from an operating table, I was a nuisance that had been pushed to the back of the shelf like an expired medical supply. I spent my time staring out the window at the San Antonio sky, watching the heavy transport planes bank toward Kelly Field, and I started to calculate the exact cost of my own blindness. The $2,400 I sent every month for a mortgage on a house I didn't live in, and the $800 for their premium health insurance that I had maintained with military precision even when my own finances were tight. The more I looked at the digital records on my government laptop, the more I realized that the practical daughter had been nothing more than a high-yield savings account to them, an account they felt entitled to draw from until the balance hit zero. I remember thinking, I was living in a modest 3-bedroom rental in Cibolo, eating at the DFAC on post to save money, and driving a 7-year-old American sedan, while my parents were living in a 4-bedroom colonial that I was effectively buying for them. It wasn't just the money. It was the fact that I had allowed them to treat my service and my rank as a logistical support system for their vanity. I had been an officer in the Medical Service Corps for nearly a decade, managing the supply chains for a Level 1 trauma center, yet I had failed to identify the massive leak in my own life. Aunt B was the only one who eventually came to see me on the 5th day. Her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed as she sat by my bed and held my hand with a grip that told me she knew everything my parents were trying to hide. She was my mother's younger sister, a retired librarian who had always been the quiet observer at family barbecues, the one who saw the way my sister, Cassidy Vance, would demand the best of everything while I worked through my holidays at Fort Sam Houston. Aunt B didn't offer excuses or platitudes. She just looked at me and said that what they had done was a sin, a violation of the very blood that was supposed to bind us together. Then she pulled out her phone, her hands trembling, as she showed me my mother's social media profile. While I was under the knife at Brooke Army Medical Center, with Major Marcus Thorne and the trauma team fighting to save my life from internal bleeding, Lorraine Vance had been posting photos from the Taylor Swift concert. There were pictures of my mother and Cassidy in VIP seats, wearing designer silk dresses that probably cost more than a specialist's monthly base pay, holding drinks and smiling for the camera as if the world were perfect. The caption on the main photo read, "A magical night with my favorite girl. Sometimes you have to ignore the burdens and just enjoy the music." The betrayal didn't sting anymore. It just felt like a cold, hard fact. The kind of data point you use to adjust your coordinates before you set a new course for a deployment. I realized then that while I was lying in a pool of my own blood in a San Antonio intersection, begging for a few hours of their time, they were singing along to pop songs and calling my survival a burden to thousands of followers in the Alamo Heights social circle. I remember thinking, I spent 15 months as a young lieutenant on a rotation to Kuwait, breathing in the dust and living in the dirt, sending nearly every cent of my hazard pay home so my sister could pretend to be a visionary. And they used that money to celebrate the fact that I wasn't there to bother them. I think most of us have a moment where the truth finally becomes too heavy to ignore, and you realize that the people you were trying to save are the ones who are happy to watch you drown. It's a quiet, hollow kind of pain that stays with you long after the physical wounds have closed, and it changes the way you see every memory you ever had. Just a heart below if you've ever been there, when you were the one everyone counted on, only to be forgotten the moment you couldn't give anymore. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe, because the words my father said next were the final confirmation that the Liliana Vance they knew was officially dead. I asked Aunt B if my grandfather, Colonel Silas Vance, knew about the accident, and she shook her head, telling me that my parents had told him I was just away on a classified training exercise and couldn't be reached. That was the moment I knew I was done playing the role of the silent provider, the daughter who kept the peace by paying for the war. I remember looking at my aunt and thinking, they think I'm a nuisance, but they've forgotten that I'm also a captain in the United States Army, and I know exactly how to secure a perimeter when it's under threat. I asked the nurse for my laptop that afternoon, my hands steady despite the pulling ache of the staples in my abdomen, and I logged into the USAA banking app that had managed my life for nearly a decade. I sat there for a long time, the cursor blinking on the screen like a heartbeat, looking at the scheduled transfers for the first of the month, the mortgage, the insurance, the emergency fund for Cassidy's lifestyle brand. I thought about the house in Alamo Heights, with its manicured lawn I had paid a landscaping service to maintain. And then I thought about my children, Leo and Maya, and the life I wanted to build for them in a home where love wasn't something you had to buy. With 3 clicks, I canceled every single one of them. I sat there in the silence of that hospital room at BMMC, the blue light of the screen reflecting off the tears I didn't even realize were falling, and I felt a strange, hollow lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt since before I put on the uniform. I remember thinking as I watched those status canceled messages pop up on the screen, if the Army taught me anything, it was how to read a map and identify a threat. And I had finally realized the threat wasn't coming from outside the wire. It was coming from the very people who claimed to be my home base. The numbers on the screen were a casualty report of my own making, a detailed record of every sacrifice I had made to ensure my sister never had to feel the weight of a real job. I had paid for the new roof after the Texas hailstorms. I had paid for the German luxury car that sat in my father's driveway. And I had even paid the legal fees when Cassidy tried to sue her first business partner for creative differences. Every time I tried to bring up the future or my own children's college fund, my mother would get that trembling, wounded tone in her voice and remind me that family meant looking out for each other, except the looking only ever went in one direction. The internal monologue in my head was a sharp, repetitive cycle. I am worth more than the $3,200 a month I send them. I am a logistics officer and a mother, and I will not be the sacrificial lamb for a sister who wouldn't even cross the street to see if I was alive. The first night after I canceled those transfers was the quietest I had experienced since the heavy-duty pickup truck hit me in that San Antonio intersection. There is a specific kind of stillness that settles over Brooke Army Medical Center at 3 a.m. The low hum of the floor buffers in the distant hallways, the rhythmic, comforting beep of a heart monitor, and the heavy, humid South Texas air pressing against the reinforced glass of the windows like a physical weight. I lay there in the dark of the Army ward, my hand resting protectively over my surgical incision, feeling the physical absence of the burden I had been carrying for nearly a decade. For 8 years, I had been an officer in the Medical Service Corps, a captain, trusted by the United States Army to manage the complex supply chains and the million-dollar budgets of a massive military hospital. Yet as I stared at the shadows on the ceiling, I realized I had been a complete amateur when it came to managing the perimeters of my own life. I remember thinking, if I had been managing a logistics unit or a medical detachment with this much negligence, I would have been relieved of command and investigated for dereliction of duty years ago. I had allowed my father, Garrett Vance, and my mother, Lorraine, to treat my career and my service like a personal credit line with no limit, all while they whispered to our neighbors in Alamo Heights that I was the one who was constantly struggling to keep my head above water. It was a cold, clinical realization, but it was the kind of cold that helps a deep wound stop bleeding. In the military, we are trained to calculate the total cost of ownership for every piece of equipment, but I had never bothered to calculate the total cost of my own family. I had spent 8 years providing logistical support for people who were happy to see me as a resource rather than a daughter. Major Marcus Thorne, the deputy commander, stopped by my room the next morning during his clinical rounds, his Army combat uniform looking sharp and professional against the sterile, white backdrop of the recovery ward. He didn't come in as a senior officer verifying a status report. He came in as a fellow soldier who had seen the glowing screen of my phone in the back of that ambulance and recognized the signature of a betrayal that no field manual could ever fully prepare you for. He pulled up a plastic chair, the heavy fabric of his uniform rustling in the quiet room, and he asked me, officer to officer, how I was really doing. I told him the truth then. about the mortgage on the colonial house, the German luxury cars, the failed lifestyle consultant brand, and the laughing emoji my sister Cassidy had sent while I was being prepped for emergency surgery at BAMC. He didn't offer the kind of empty civilian comforts that people usually use to avoid the truth. And he didn't tell me that family is family, a phrase that in my experience usually just means you're expected to tolerate a higher level of abuse. Instead, he told me that the Army had specific resources for this kind of situation, reminding me that as a service member, I had protections that most people didn't even know existed. He mentioned that I should speak with a major in the JAG office, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, about the general power of attorney I had signed for my father during my last rotation to the Middle East. I remember thinking, here is a man I've known for 3 years who is showing me more loyalty and tactical support in a hospital chair than the man who raised me has shown me in 34 years. It was a professional observation that finally stripped away the last of the sentimentality I had been using to excuse my father's greed. Aunt Bee returned that afternoon, bringing the scent of the outside world with her. A plastic container of Texas brisket from a local smokehouse, and 2 big red sodas that felt like a luxury after days of hospital broth. We sat in silence for a while as I ate, the late summer sun casting long, golden shadows across the linoleum floor of the Fort Sam Houston facility. She told me that the news of my decision had already reached the house in Alamo Heights like a shockwave. Apparently, the mortgage company had called my father at 8 in the morning because the USAA wire transfer had failed for the first time in 96 months. And the social facade they had spent years building in San Antonio was already starting to crumble under the weight of reality. She told me that my mother, Lorraine Vance, was currently telling anyone who would listen at her garden club and volunteer committee meetings that the stress of the military had finally caused me to have a mental breakdown. I remember thinking, they are already executing a defensive maneuver, trying to paint me as an unstable soldier to discredit the truth before I even have the chance to speak it. It was a classic attempt to poison the well, but they had forgotten that I was a logistics officer with a verified digital paper trail that stretched back nearly a decade. They thought they could use my uniform against me, but they didn't realize that the Army had taught me exactly how to document a failure. The most painful discovery came as I was reviewing the credit reports I had requested through the JAG referral on my laptop. I found 3 separate lines of credit that had been opened in my name over the last 2 years, totaling over $40,000, all signed with the general power of attorney I had entrusted to my father, Garrett Vance, while I was overseas. He hadn't just been taking the money I gave him. He had been harvesting my credit score to fund a lifestyle that none of them could actually afford. I remember thinking, I was in a combat zone, trusting him to protect my children's future, and he was using my name to buy more time for a lie in Alamo Heights. He had used my power of attorney as a tool for his own vanity, turning my financial security into a casualty of his social ambitions. I sat there looking at the numbers, realizing that the $360,000 I had sent them was only the beginning of the damage. My father had reached into my future and taken money I hadn't even earned yet, all while my mother and sister were laughing at my injuries. The Medical Service Corps teaches us to manage resources with absolute transparency, but my own father had been running a shadow operation with my life as the collateral. I felt a surge of cold, clinical anger, the kind that makes your hands steady and your mind clear. I wasn't just a daughter who had been hurt. I was an officer whose trust had been violated in a way that the Uniform Code of Military Justice would find very interesting. By the time the moon rose over the San Antonio plains and the lights of the ward were dimmed, I had a plan that went far beyond just stopping the monthly payments. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I was done being the silent provider for a family that viewed my survival as an inconvenience to their social calendar. I was going to ensure that the truth of what they had done was documented, undeniable, and presented in a way that no amount of my mother's tears would be able to erase. I was no longer interested in keeping the peace. I was interested in securing my children's future and reclaiming the name they had tried to turn into a debt. I was going to use every bit of my logistical training to dismantle the structure of lies they had built, and I was going to do it with the same precision I used to run a Level 1 trauma center. The discharge from Brooke Army Medical Center felt less like a medical release and more like a tactical redeployment. I spent my final 48 hours in that hospital bed not just recovering, but operating with the cold, calculated focus of a logistics officer prepping for a command inspection. I utilized the hospital's secure Wi-Fi to pull every archived LES, my Army leave and earning statements, and cross-reference them with nearly a decade of USAA bank records. I built a digital dossier that accounted for every cent of the $360,000 I had funneled into Alamo Heights, categorized by emergency mortgage support, luxury maintenance, and sibling business subsidies. I remember thinking, I have spent my career ensuring that every medical supply at JBSA Fort Sam Houston is accounted for to the penny. And it's time I applied that same accountability to the people who treated my life like a disposable resource. The South Texas air was thick with the scent of dry cedar and hot asphalt as Major Marcus Thorne walked me to the curb on the day of my release, his hand steady on my arm as I navigated the transition to the passenger seat. I watched the sterile white walls of the medical center recede, thinking that for 9 years, that building had been my sanctuary because the rules were based on merit and the missions were defined by truth. Now, I was heading back to a house in Cibolo that felt like a fortress I had built with bricks of resentment and mortar made from my own blood. The drive was quiet, the suburban sprawl of San Antonio blurring past in a haze of H-E-B grocery stores and strip malls, and I found myself staring at the vast blue of the Texas sky, realizing that the silence from my phone was the most expensive thing I'd ever bought, and it was worth every single penny I'd clawed back. When I finally pulled into my driveway and saw the messy evidence of my children's lives scattered across the porch, a discarded plastic truck and a drawing of a yellow smudge, the breath I had been holding for 6 days finally left my lungs. My kids, Leo and Maya, came screaming through the front door the moment the engine cut, their small bodies colliding with my legs with a force that sent a jolt of sharp pain through my surgical incision. I didn't care about the ache. I just knelt there on the hot Texas concrete and pulled them into my arms, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and realizing these 2 little humans were the only mission that had ever mattered. The nanny I had hired from the emergency service, a woman from New Braunfels who had managed the house with military-grade efficiency, gave me a quiet nod of respect. I paid her a bonus that would have covered half of my sister's monthly luxury lease, and I didn't regret a single cent of it, because she had provided the care that my own mother, Lorraine Vance, couldn't spare between Taylor Swift concert sets. I remember thinking as I watched her drive away, I am an officer who manages hospital logistics for the Department of Defense. Yet I had to pay a stranger to do what my own parents wouldn't do for free. And that is a debt I will never be able to settle with a bank transfer. It was a Saturday morning, the kind of day when the Texas sun is already aggressive by 9 o'clock, and I was sitting at the kitchen table nursing a lukewarm cup of tea while looking at the power of attorney documents the JAG office had helped me flag. The knock on the front door was 3 sharp, rhythmic raps that didn't sound like the frantic pounding of my father, Garrett Vance, or the hesitant scratching of my sister, Cassidy. Standing on my doorstep was my grandfather, Colonel Silas Vance, 76 years old, a retired officer in the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. He was a man who still carried himself with the rigid posture of an officer who had spent 40 years deciding the fate of men and women under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I hadn't seen him in 3 years because my parents always claimed he was too frail for the drive. But seeing him now, I realized those were just more lies designed to keep the practical daughter isolated from the only person in the family who understood the meaning of a commission. I opened the door, and he didn't say a word. He just reached out and pulled me into a hug that was so certain that I felt my professional armor start to crumble. "Liliana," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I know everything. Aunt Bee called me the night of the accident, and she told me what Garrett and Lorraine said to you while you were lying in that ambulance." He pulled back, his hands resting on my shoulders, his blue eyes as sharp as a surgeon's blade. "I've watched them exploit your sense of duty for a decade, and I've watched them treat your sister like a queen while they treated you like a supply chain. But that ends today." He sat at my table and watched Leo and Maya with a soft smile, then turned back to me with the clinical focus of a judge reviewing a case file. He didn't ask me for a favor. He asked me for the folder I had been building. I showed him the line item evidence of the $360,000 and the fraudulent credit lines my father had opened using the power of attorney I had signed before my last rotation to the Middle East. I saw the way his jaw tightened. That legal mind was already beginning to build a strategy that no amount of my mother's performative tears would be able to dismantle. "Captain Vance," he said, using my rank with a level of respect that made my throat tighten. "An officer deserves to have their flank protected by their own kin, not to be shot in the back by them while they're down. I am having a celebration for my 76th birthday next Saturday in Alamo Heights, and the entire family will be there, including the people who think they can spend your life like currency." I arrived at my grandfather's estate the following week, the colonial house standing like a monument to old Texas authority. I wore a simple navy dress, something professional and understated that reminded me I was still an officer, even without the uniform. I remember thinking, I am entering a hostile environment, and the only intelligence I have is the truth contained in the folder sitting on the passenger seat. The party was already in full swing when I walked in, a string quartet playing and waiters circulating with expensive champagne. I spotted them immediately near the grand fireplace. My mother, Lorraine Vance, was at something a cousin said, and my father, Garrett, was holding court with a group of old business associates. They saw me at the same moment, and I watched the color drain from my mother's face, while my father's expression turned into a mask of rigid indifference. Cassidy Vance appeared a moment later, gliding over in a designer silk dress that looked like it had been bought with the very mortgage payment I had canceled 10 days ago. "Liliana, you actually came," my sister said, her voice carrying that manufactured sweetness, though her eyes remained as cold as a Texas norther. "We heard you've been having a bit of a difficult time since the accident. Mom said you were acting quite erratically, cutting everyone off for no reason." I met her gaze with the same clinical detachment I used when managing a mass casualty intake, and I told her that a ruptured spleen tended to change a person's perspective on what was erratic and what was necessary for survival. I stood there in the middle of that room, watching the people who raised me tell everyone I was losing my mind just to protect their own bank accounts. I knew that in a few minutes, I had to decide whether to let the lie stand for the sake of family or to lay the facts out in front of everyone. I've realized that sometimes the only way to find peace is to walk through the fire of the truth, even if it burns the bridge behind you. If you were in my exact position, stay quiet to keep the peace or lay the facts out in front of everyone, what would you do? Leave a yes for exposing them or a no for walking away in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. Here is what my grandfather decided to do, and it changed our family forever. The room went quiet suddenly as my grandfather, Silas Vance, stepped onto the small raised platform near the dining area of his Alamo Heights estate, clinking a silver spoon against his crystal glass with a sound like a gavel strike in a federal courtroom. He still commanded the room with the rigid, unmistakable authority of a retired colonel, and I saw my father, Garrett, straighten his tie while my mother, Lorraine, put on her most attentive, loving daughter face for the benefit of the gathered guests. Silas looked around the room, his eyes lingering on me for a second longer than anyone else, and I felt the weight of the manila folder in my hands like a loaded weapon ready to be deployed. He thanked everyone for coming, but then his voice shifted, losing its social warmth and taking on the steel-edged resonance of a judge about to deliver a final, irreversible verdict. "Before we cut the cake," he said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the estate, "there is a matter of family honor that needs to be addressed in front of everyone here." I saw my mother's hand flutter to her throat, and my sister, Cassidy, take a small step back into the shadows of the hallway, her designer silk dress rustling in the sudden silence. Silas turned his gaze directly toward my father and asked him a simple question that cut through the polite atmosphere of the party like a knife. He asked who had been paying the mortgage on the Vance family home for the last 96 months. My father's face went from pale to a deep, embarrassed red, and he stammered that it was a private family matter that didn't need to be discussed at a birthday celebration. It became a public matter the moment you and Lorraine started telling this family that your daughter was mentally unstable to cover up the fact that you've been living off her military salary, my grandfather said, his voice hardening into a roar that silenced even the string quartet in the corner. He walked over to me and took the manila folder, opening it with the practiced ease of a man reviewing a case file, and began to read the numbers aloud for the entire San Antonio elite to hear. 8 years of transfers, $2,400 a month for the house, $800 for health insurance, and the constant bailouts for Cassidy's failed brand. It all came pouring out in front of every aunt, uncle, and cousin we had. I remember thinking, I spent 15 months in a combat zone as a young officer sending hazard pay home so they could pretend to be wealthy. And now, the whole world finally knows the cost of their charade. The humiliation in the room was a physical weight, but it wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was theirs. My mother started to cry, the same delicate, performative tears she had used for years to get her way. But my grandfather didn't even look at her as he turned the page to the medical reports from my surgery at Brooke Army Medical Center. He told the room about the accident, about the internal bleeding, and then he read the text message my mother had sent about the Taylor Swift tickets and the nuisance I had supposedly become. But then he stopped and looked at the extended family, his eyes burning with a cold fury I had never seen before. "And here is the most shameful part," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "To explain why they were taking so much of Liliana's money, Garrett and Lorraine told many of you that she was facing a general court-martial for mismanagement of funds. They told you she was being dishonorably discharged and that they were saving her money to keep her out of military prison. They didn't just steal her future. They tried to murder her reputation to hide their own greed." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of vacuum that occurs after a massive explosion. I looked at my cousins and my aunts, seeing the shock and the realization on their faces. They had actually believed I was a disgraced officer because my own parents had used the most severe military shame as a cover for their luxury car payments. My father looked at his shoes, and my sister stared at the floor. And I realized that for the first time in 34 years, the practical daughter was the only one in the room with any dignity left. I stepped forward into the center of that grand room, my hand resting over the scar on my abdomen, and I looked at my parents not with anger, but with the same clinical distance I would use to examine a patient who was beyond my help. The nuisance had finally stopped apologizing for her existence. I told my father, Garrett Vance, that he had been right about one thing. I was an officer trained in medical logistics, and I knew exactly how to treat a toxic infection, which is why I was cutting them out of my life to save what was left of my own. I told them that I had already filed a report with the JAG office at Fort Sam Houston regarding the power of attorney fraud, and that the Army would be handling the recovery of the $40,000 in illegal credit lines through every legal channel available. I turned and walked out of that house without looking back, the sound of my heels on the hardwood floor, feeling like the steady beat of a drum, leading me toward a freedom I had never permitted myself to imagine. I remember thinking as I buckled Leo and Maya into their car seats under the vast, starlit Texas sky, that the $360,000 I had lost was a small price to pay for the clarity I had gained. The drive back to Cibolo was the most peaceful 60 minutes of my life, the road ahead illuminated by my own headlights, and the knowledge that I no longer owed a single cent of my soul to people who viewed my loyalty as a transaction. I'm sitting here now, 6 months after that night, looking at a life that finally belongs entirely to me and my children. There's a quiet dignity in knowing that the boundaries you've drawn are the only things keeping your peace intact. And I finally understand that walking away wasn't a defeat. It was a promotion. I'd love for you to drop it in the comments. Before I tell you what actually happened to them, what does justice look like to you in a situation like this? Then, after you hear the end, tell me, was it enough? And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. What came next was something even the JAG attorneys said they hadn't seen in a family dispute in years. Because I stopped the automatic USAA transfers and reported the power of attorney fraud, Garrett and Lorraine Vance were forced to put the Alamo Heights house on the market within 90 days, as they couldn't cover the property taxes or the mortgage without my captain's salary. They are currently living in Aunt Bee's small guest house under a strict agreement that requires my father to work 40 hours a week at a local hardware store to pay for his own groceries. Cassidy Vance lost her luxury lease and her consulting office when the creditors finally moved in, and she is now waitressing at a diner in Austin, learning for the first time what it's like to stand on her own feet for an 8-hour shift, while the JAG office oversees the garnishment of their limited assets to repay the fraudulent loans they took out in my name. I used to believe that love was a rank I had to earn through a decade of service and financial sacrifice, a destination I could reach if I just provided enough support. Now I understand that I am a mother and an officer whose value was never defined by the bills I paid for people who didn't love me, and that my true duty was always to the little ones waiting for me at home. I still drive past the turnoff for Alamo Heights sometimes, and I keep going.